Well, hello, Endow women. I have a very, very special guest today, Dr. Maria Fedoryka, and she is a professor of philosophy at Ave Maria University. And if you just Google her, you'll see how cool she is with all the things she thinks about, teaches about, writes about. But I encountered her in a deeper way in the summer of 2020 through the seminar that the Hildebrand Project took online because of COVID, and was able to hear her lecture about many things, and was just so moved, struck, educated, inspired, and wanted to introduce her to you if you haven't encountered her yet. So Maria, thank you so much for being on the Endow podcast and YouTube channel.
Oh, well, thank you, Simone. I should make you my PR person. That was a very generous introduction. Thank you
Well,
for that.
it was just so hard to, thinking about what do I want to ask you about, because there's so much that you have written about and studied and teach, that this is just a real treat for me. And I know for the women who are listening and our faithful men who also tune in, I know they're just gonna love this, and they're gonna have all sorts of self-imposed homework after listening to this conversation. So I think one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, and by the way, I'm gonna link up your website and all of that to the podcast so that people can find you easily, because I know that they're going to want to after listening to you. But I think one of my most favorite Endow studies is our Endow study on Edith Stein, who was a phenomenologist. So I am not a professional philosopher, so I would just love to hear your explanation of what is phenomenology, because it's so important. It's a school of thought, I think, that was founded in the early 20th century, and Edith Stein was one of those awesome women game changers when it came to that. And then later John Paul II was also a phenomenologist. So how would a layman like me describe or explain phenomenology, because I haven't studied it formally yet?
Wow, well, this is actually a very, very big question, and I could give you about 4-hour answer to that. But I'll try to keep it down to more like 4 minutes.
These appetizers, we just have to enjoy what we can.
Yeah, sure. So it was born in the early 20th century, and Husserl was sort of the father of phenomenology, Husserl. And exactly, Edith Stein was really, she was his first right-hand man. She was his number one assistant for a few years. And what happened with phenomenology is, just very briefly to situate it historically, because you can't really understand phenomenology if you don't understand what was going on at the time, which is that philosophy had become, so real philosophy had kind of died. Philosophy became either a sort of study of textbooks, kind of who said what, or it was a kind of, well, it had inherited Kant's view of the world, which is that we cannot know reality as it is in itself. All we can know is reality as it appears to us in our own, peeping little minds. That's it. And what Husserl did is he established a way of, in a sense, proving or giving evidence for the fact that we do actually break through the confines of our own mind, and we actually reach reality as it is in itself. And that was really the original breakthrough of Husserl. So I should say that phenomenology then broke out into many different strands, and some of them are not, they're not faithful to Husserl's early discovery. But Edith Stein definitely followed that early discovery. And so it was really a return to real philosophy as a study of reality as it is in itself. So that's really the basic thing. And one of the things that happened that's so important is it meant that there was a kind of a return to a very rich, a discovery of the richness of reality. So it wasn't just sort of abstract, theoretical assertions, but it really the thinkers wanted to be in touch with reality in its quality, in its texture, in its depth, and the fullness of, you could say, it's instead of being black and white and sort of technicolor. And that's why it was so exciting for the people who discovered it. It meant to return to reality in all of its richness and fullness.
Interesting. So how did it, I love that, because what are we doing as philosophers, or baby philosophers, or amateur philosophers, or human beings that have questions, if not wanting to know reality better? What was I think the method of it? I know that's a huge question, so maybe this is not the time to have that conversation, but the excitement, a method that was exciting that say we can't just like return to Aristotle, or is this like a new Aristotelianism? I mean, I'm throwing these questions out, pretty much ignorance.
Sure. Yeah. So I would say that that's also a big question. There are a lot of methodological aspects, but if I were going to say that the key one, the very foundational one, was pretty simple. It said back to things themselves.
Mm.
Back to things themselves. And this is what happened. Your question about Aristotle is kind of interesting, because what happened is then the philosophers in this movement, they did actually go back to the original sources. Okay, so back to things. I mean, let's go back to reality. Let's stop looking at books, at textbooks, at who said what. Let's look at reality. But what's really neat is any philosopher who's a genuine philosopher was doing that. That means Aristotle was doing it. That means Plato was doing it. Aquinas was doing it. All of those thinkers. But what's neat is that the people in this movement, the philosophers in this movement, when they went back to the texts, instead of reading them simply as who said what, they were seeing reality through the text. They were using Aristotle to help them reach reality as it is in itself. So even these texts then really came alive in a new way. So you have the history of philosophy now, instead of being a stale, dusty kind of procedure, was another way of getting into contact with the richness of the world and of reality.
Yeah, so it's not just reading to learn about, but reading as a, correct me if I'm wrong, as a criteria for judgment about my life that's happening now.
Yes,
Perhaps.
exactly. Very good.
That's awesome.
Yep.
That resonates a lot with me as somebody who's been formed a lot by Father Giussani and the charism of communal liberation. So, I mean, I don't always know where all these things converge or merge, but, you know, this idea that that philosophy and theology is supposed to jump out of the pages and become relevant in something in my life is something that I've been formed in. And I think that that's kind of the beauty of also in an Endow study is that, you know, it's access to the primary source, the commentary, secondary source to unpack it, and then the questions that really kind of help you look at our rich Catholic intellectual tradition and inheritance through the reality of your own life. And is Christ something that's transforming and changing? Because if not, then what are we all doing? And then it does become like a dusty, I like that image you brought up of like the stale, dusty library. So where does, explain, this is a great day for me. I get to ask this, you know, as expert on these things. Tell me, where does personalism come in? Because we hear that John Paul II was a personalist. Does that intersect with phenomenology?
Yeah. So as a matter of historical fact, John Paul II was very influenced by certain figures in the phenomenological movement. So he wrote his dissertation on Max Scheler. And he, of course, was critical of certain very fundamental things, but he was very much influenced by the phenomenological approach. And so he's also a personalist. And there is some convergence between phenomenology and personalism, because what happens is, I have to introduce one more element of the phenomenological method, which was because of this need for each philosopher to get in touch with reality for himself, not just to repeat what somebody else said, but to see for himself. It really awakened a kind of interiority. In other words, an awareness of what's going on within my own consciousness, within my own soul, within my own experience. Right. And that gave birth to a kind of new awareness of the interiority of the person. So a person isn't just somebody that you can see from the outside. And we can say, yeah, the evidence tells us that human beings are free and animals aren't. Human beings are rational, but animals aren't. All the external evidence tells us that. But to say something like, wait, I experience my own freedom from the inside. I experience what it means to know truth, to be in touch with the world. And so the whole interiority of the person became a real field of study. And it actually hadn't been so much within the tradition. Yeah. Wow. And now when we look back, we see seeds of it. But what personalism does is it says, well, now I'm going to actually examine the person from within. And that gave rise to all sorts of new discoveries, to take that very seriously. And maybe we'll get to the topic of the emotions, but of course, the emotions become very vividly present to us from within as well. So that's just a very brief introduction. And I would say that what is personalism, how I would describe it? I would describe it as a kind of orientation in philosophy that takes the person as the most fundamental reality in all of existence. So we're not just one being among others. We're not just a rational animal. We actually stand above and beyond everything else that's created. And so there's a tremendous importance to the study of the person. It's the most important thing. And the other dimension is, when we study the person, let's be attentive to what is really personal. Let's not reduce the person to a mere animal or just another part of the world.
Interesting. So then in a way, the theological presupposition is that, man is the height of creation. And then starting with that fundamental belief, then we take every aspect of the person seriously, and that becomes the starting point. Where in history can we place personalism? Where does that start? I guess any true good philosophy or philosopher, it's always been part of it, because you are taking yourself and your relationship with reality seriously. But in terms of how we talk about this like personalist movement or personalism, where is that placed in history?
That's definitely in the 20th century. And you have people like Edith Stein would have been a personalist. She didn't call herself that yet, but also Dietrich von Hildebrand and so forth. But the really interesting thing is that you had this movement arising in several different places independently of one another, which is really neat.
Yeah, that is very, very Holy Spirit, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you have various different representatives. You have Gabriel Marcel, you have Martin Buber's a personalist, and these people weren't in contact with Hildebrand, but it was just kind of happening simultaneously. It could have been connected with the problems of the 20th century, but I actually tend to agree more with you that I think it's the Holy Spirit inspired it, because it was a particular need of our time with the dehumanization and depersonalization that was about to take place with, on the one hand, these Marxist communist movements, the totalitarian ones that destroy the individual, and on the other hand, technology, which also tends to undermine and destroy the individual.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, these people were prophetic, kind of recognizing this like need to return to the human.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So interesting. Okay, then my last question on this before we get into some love talk, because, Valentine's Day is coming up, and, Galentine's, and so this new fun, have a gal pal night, just such a funny little cultural thing that came out of the United States. But where does existentialism come in, or French? I guess in my earlier years, I had read some French Catholic existentialists and thought, and this is well before I ever studied theology, Maria, I thought, if I ever have to write a big dissertation or paper, I think it's going to be on French Catholic existentialism. You make these claims when you're young, you don't even know anything. Where does that all come into this? Because it seems to me that this is also a point of convergence with the experience being taken seriously in philosophical thought.
Yeah. Wow. You're asking me such huge questions one after the next.
I apologize. I know it's it's a podcast, and this is an appetizer, but my dreams are coming true right now. So
no, it's great. I think it's great. So existentialism, it's also related. It has a sort of a similar method and approach to something like personalism. And you have probably the central idea is to take the flesh and blood sort of person who's here and now as somehow central to the philosophical quest. What is the person experiencing? How does he see the world? The drama of his own existence is somehow really the starting point for understanding the rest of the world. And it doesn't mean that the rest of the world doesn't have its own being, doesn't have its own importance, doesn't make demands on the human person, but it's just recognizing that the most dramatic aspect of reality is the human person in their freedom and in their choices. So, and that's probably, of course, you have atheistic existentialism, right? On the one hand, you have somebody like Sartre, maybe Heidegger in another way. But then you have, as you said, the French existentialism, like Gabriel Marcel. And these include a vision of the human person as related to God. Kierkegaard also, he's really the father of existentialism. He lived in the 19th century. He was a Danish philosopher. And I would say that he's the father of existentialism, because for him, the center point of all of existence is my own existence, not just persons in general, but my own existence.
Mine, yeah. Oh, very
So,
fascinating.
yeah.
Well, we won't continue on there, although I wish we could.
Mhm.
Well, there's two roads I want to go on. I want to go on both, but I just have to stop and ask you right now, in terms of your own personal vocation as a philosopher and as a professor, I think I read that you encountered all of this as a teenager, and that set you on so do you feel like your personal vocation in this life of the mind was determined right from the beginning of your awareness of yourself and I would love to hear a little bit about your story.
Oh, well, that's a very nice question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my father was a philosopher, so I probably have to start with that.
Yeah.
And for as long as I can remember, I was just thrilled to be part of, even if I was just a fly on the wall, sort of involved in philosophical conversations. And my father would invite his students he was teaching at the University of Dallas at the time, and he would have pizza night, and he would make pizza and he would discuss philosophy. And we were allowed to stay up as late as we wanted on those days.
Oh.
And and so I always did, and I listened to their conversations. And when I was probably 15, I read two books that had a big influence on me, which was Chesterton's Orthodoxy and St. Augustine's Confessions.
Wow.
And I would say St. Augustine is probably, we could call him a proto-existentialist or a proto-personalist, which means he anticipated a lot of the themes that we see in personalism and in existentialism. So, and in any case, I really both of those books just thrilled me to the core of my being. And I would say they put me definitively on the path of, I want to spend my life studying this kind of thing. So, and then the books of Dietrich von Hildebrand also, but those I can't even remember when they began to influence me, because they were always part of my life. But when I was probably also maybe a little older, maybe 16, I read his book Transformation in Christ and his book Purity, which is his major work on human sexuality, love, intimacy. And that was it.
That was it. I love the fact that you were 15. That's so young. And orthodoxy, that's, if those were two of like your kind of like touchstones at that kind of formative moment, orthodoxy seems to be like this big case out there in the world, like the intellectual life. And then the confession seems to have been something that perhaps, and let me know, I'm making this up thinking this is your experience here, that it grabbed your heart the way that Augustine is such a heart grabber. So it seems like your reason and affection were engaged in those two books.
Yeah.
And I don't know, that's
Yeah.
for me, those two books did that. Yeah.
That could very well be. Could very well be. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah. I'm not saying I understood everything in either of the books at the age of 15, but
yeah, but they were charming enough.
Yeah, I understood enough to just know, to be utterly captivated. So.
Yes, there's truth here, and I want to be on this path. Could you give a word of encouragement to our Endow women about, because Endow is probably like the hardest thing to market, in the sense that it is saying that community is a value, that you need friendships, and that actually studying great texts is more enriching in a community. But for a lot of our busy moms, or we're just a very busy culture, what would you say, like as a woman who's a philosopher, to encourage women to continue to study, whether it's through Endow or not? And I'm definitely going to link up Hildebrand project, because it was so life-changing for me this past summer, and I rewatched a lot of the videos with my sister, and I said, you guys sit down, we're gonna watch this together, so just in a world that doesn't really make time for the life of the mind, I just wanted to know, as a woman, how would you encourage our women to continue study?
Yeah, well, in some ways, I'm not the best person to ask, just because philosophy is my life, it's my profession, and so I'm so blessed to, wake up every morning, and that's my duty, right?
Yeah, that's your job.
But I will, but I do have some thoughts. So first of all, if you have time to read, then I definitely think pick up one of these books. Don't pick up sort of, whatever current novels if you
Yes.
have time. And but it is important. Maybe Simone, you could even put a list up on your website or something. There are books that are accessible, that sort of grow the life of the mind, but sometimes people don't know where to start.
Yeah.
So I think that I could give you a list of some books, and I think that you should interview some female intellectuals and
Yes.
ask, where would people begin? Because they're like Joseph Pieper, for example, is an
Oh,
author that,
favorite of
right,
mine.
you know him, that's very accessible.
Yep.
So that's the first thing, is that women have to know where to start, and there maybe you could help them with that, and I would be happy to contribute. But the other thing is, this is one of the most exciting times to live in that sense, because YouTube has countless amazing talks and lectures. And you just mentioned one important source is the Hildebrand Project, a lot of accessible lectures on there. But for myself, sometimes I would just Google something that I'm interested in, like the emotions, and I'm preparing dinner and I just have a ball listening to, you know what I mean? And
Yes.
not that a mother with many children could, close herself up with her earbuds while she's doing things, but maybe it's a part of the time she can.
Yeah.
And you can actually vacuum and dust while you're listening to a podcast of some sort. So
Very, very
that would
true.
probably be the other thing that I would say.
That's great. Thank you, Maria. Okay, now to the heart, to affectivity, to
Mm.
love and philosophy of love. I'm just going to listen. So if you've got 10 minutes to just give us a taste of where your mind is with all of that, and what you taught and studied. I think this is February with Valentine's, and also with entering into Lent, is a great time to really think about love. So.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Another big question.
Another big question. I know you can handle it, Maria.
Well, the problem is where to start and where to
I was
end.
going to say narrowing it. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, my curiosity is always on the affect, and I have the reader from the Hildebrand Project, and it's like, okay, I'm making my way through it. I have a little unofficial group where we're trying to catching up from the summer reading it, but I would, the role of emotions, I think, is so
Sure.
love.
Yeah. So maybe what I'll do is I'll answer in two parts. First, I'm just going to talk a little bit about love, maybe the importance and how I see it, and what my approach is to it when I teach, and then I'll move on to the emotions. So just very briefly about love. Love, it's kind of funny to say love tends to get a bad rap in philosophy. It tends to get neglected in philosophy. And in my own sort of considerations of the person, it's really thinking about the person that led me to the absolute centrality of love. But since I started noticing the centrality of love for the human person, it kind of led me to see, actually, no, it's the foundation of God's being as well. And it's actually behind all of creation. It's behind all of the whole entire relationship between God and man, and God and the world. It actually explains absolutely everything about everything.
Wow.
Right? God wouldn't have created if he weren't love. God wouldn't be three persons if he wasn't love. In fact, I argue in a published paper that God wouldn't exist if he weren't love. The only thing that makes sense of his existence is that he exists in the happiness of a community of three persons in love. So it's a whole span that I deal with. Yeah. And then so the motive of our creation is love. And then what I do with one of my favorite parts of my philosophy of love course is to show how, in the setup that God made with the human person, he actually invites other creatures to enter into his loving creative act. And so then you see, how does the human person come into existence? By the cooperation of other human persons, literally being taken up into the loving act of God. And of course, that's what marriage is.
Yes.
And so then the development of the human person, for the person to come into existence now, not just physically, but also emotionally and spiritually, and as a person and as the individual that they are, everything requires love, and everything is love. Right? For the human person to wake up, to become Maria or Simone or whoever they are, and not just a generic being. It's all about love. So I also do the philosophy of psychology, and the way in which the healthy development of the person depends on this interpersonal relationship of total affirmation and acceptance, and everything that entails. So that's I think just the all-encompassing nature of love is what I try to fill my students with a sense of.
Right. And I loved your focus on the other, right? That that man finds himself in a sincere gift of self,
Yeah.
I think that was John Paul II's most quoted line. That's what I hear anyway. And that you really can't be yourself without other people, because you really can't experience love without the other.
Exactly.
I remember reading, I think it was Richard of St. Victor he started with the Trinity, and then kind of philosophically proves why God has to be three. So it's kind of fun starting with theology and then working backwards but I remember that being so earth-shattering for me when I first encountered it, that like actually the reality of love, like you said, it can't be without a community of persons. It just, for Maria to become Maria, for like you said, Simone, for Simone, like you need another person. And then I start to think about our other epidemic, the epidemic of loneliness, and you think about how loveless we've become in this culture. Oof, talk about a big thing. About the big thing to,
No, it's incredible. And that's what Mother Teresa was all about. She said, I'm not here to alleviate the suffering, although she did that too. She said, I'm here to actually change the suffering into something beautiful by being with the person in their suffering unconditionally, totally, to give myself to the other, being willing to suffer with them so that they are not alone in their suffering. And she says the only real suffering is being alone. And I think it's true.
I think that's true too. And didn't she say the United States was the poorest country in her mind? Because of that.
Yeah. So my right now, my current definition of love is to be all about the other.
All about the other. I love that. I love that. And that's liberation, because I think that's true freedom. That's true freedom.
Yeah.
So and then you said there was a second thing that you wanted to.
So then now the second thing is just to talk a little bit about the emotions and the centrality of love. I mean, and this might scandalize some people, but I think that there's a special centrality of emotions when it comes to love. At the heart.
I love that. And it is scandalizing. And I say it. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm glad to have your support.
Freedom. I think you're right. Thank you for saying it. I had so many of these moments listening to the Hildebrand thought, yes, I'm not crazy. I might not have the philosophical background for it, but I think my intuition, confirmed a lot of that. Anyway.
Yeah. So Simone, that experience that you described is very beautiful and very important, because what you are doing right there is being phenomenological. That's what the phenomenologists aimed for, is to develop a theory of reality that actually was in keeping with their pre-philosophical real contact with being and with truth and with reality. You see that? Because what we tend to do in our theories is we tend to sort of argue away or theoreticize away our genuine contact with reality. And if we're all honest about what our intuition is, the heart is at the center of love, right? It's just at the center of love.
Preach it.
Yeah. So, and of course, I mean, again, I can't give a whole course on it. We know that the person is made up both of, we could say they're three-dimensional. There's the intellect, by which we know, then there's the freedom by which we actually make a choice that we can govern ourselves, and then there's the heart by which we feel. And all three, of course, have to work with one another. And the way I see it, it's almost like our freedom, our free choice, and our emotions, they hand the baton off to each other in different areas of life. And of course, if you're married and sometimes if you become dry emotionally, your free will says, I'm not going to abandon this relationship. And it carries the burden for the heart when the heart is suffering or dry or incapable. And that's very beautiful and that's very important. But it is a suffering. Why? Because love is emotions are central to love. And that's really where it happens in some very important way. So maybe I'll just briefly tell you how I understand the emotions. I understand the heart as being, you could say, that place within our being where we can gain an intimate contact with reality. So not a distant one, but an intimate one. So I use many silly examples, but if you get, the most, let's say with my students, you get the most amazingly soft blanket in a care package from your sister or something, and
Yeah.
you say, look to your roommate, this is so amazingly soft, and they're on the other side of the room and they say, oh yeah, that's great. You're going to be disappointed that they don't walk over, get close enough to actually touch that blanket and to experience it.
Right.
We're in those feelings, right? So we use the word feeling. Well, that's the analogy. How do you feel something with your fingers? You get up very close. You have to touch it, proximity, right?
Right.
It's the same thing. That's why we use the language of feeling, of being moved, of being touched. All of those imply getting really close. You can't move or touch something unless you come right against
Right
it.
up against it.
Right?
Yeah.
Reality comes right up against the depth of our being when we feel it, right? When we have
I
an
love
emotion with
it.
respect
This
to it.
is
Yeah.
so important. It's so.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of my Italian friend who says reality. Sometimes your heart just jumps out of your chest and punches you in the face. We
Yeah.
can only avoid the heart for so long
Yeah.
before it just punches us in the face.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. And what you're saying actually opens up another side of things, which is if we are feeling something, we have to deal with that because, like it or not, that is, as your friend says, it is extremely real. It has a very powerful, you could say, it takes up a lot of space within us.
Yeah.
And it should, right? That's what the emotions are.
Right.
And we can say they're not important and we can try to shut them down and so forth, but it doesn't work. They're like an energy that if you shut it down in one place, it's going to start popping up in others. And that's why unresolved emotions then can wreak havoc in the rest of our
Right.
lives.
I think that's how we experience trauma. And it's a traumatizing thing when, the body keeps the score, as they say. But I think as a church too, I think a real temptation is to white knuckle it in morality and to not take the heart seriously, and then that lack of taking yourself seriously, because if the heart is the center of the being and affectivity is in the center of your being, then we see people who haven't come alive, who and then that has, my lighting is interesting right now, and that has big ramifications, I think, for evangelization too. Not to make it about evangelization, but I mean,
huge. No, Simone, you're actually touching on something that's been on my mind a lot, because there are certain preachers who think that, what they need to do is tell you about the doctrine and just tell you about the truth, the moral life, and so forth. And it's incredible. Until it reaches the heart of their listeners, it's going to mean nothing. It's not going to be life-changing. And there, Dietrich von Hildebrand has an interesting idea. He says the heart is the true self of the person in some important way. So if when we evangelize, when we talk to people about reality, we have to find ways of reaching their heart. You may know that Cardinal Newman, his motto was cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart. What he means is one person reaches another only in and through the heart, but that also means that truth reaches the other only when it reaches their heart.
Yeah, if it were only as easy as just teaching brilliant doctrinal courses, or if it were that easy, sure, everybody would end up being a disciple of Jesus, but it's not. And that's where you can't just, if only all my students converted from my high school theology classes, but the heart has to be engaged. And I think we could spend more time as a church focused on that, which is another reason why the Hildebrand Project was so meaningful for me, because I thought this is actually where we should be directing our efforts. This is the answer to the problem of the person now in modernity, post-modernity, whatever we're calling ourselves. Because you can only, your heart will jump out of your chest and punch you in the face. And I think, if I may, our culture is experiencing a lot of that. And so we need to take that heart seriously and provide it with the true answer to it. So anyway.
There's no question. Yeah. And, maybe I'll just say one other thing, which is, is the realm of the emotions also touched by original sin and tainted by original sin? Does it have its shadow side or its fallen side? Absolutely. And, there are a lot of ways in which our lives can go wrong because our emotions aren't in order. So I do want to acknowledge that. But what's happened throughout the history is the baby is thrown out with the bathwater. Instead of saying, let's help. Well, this is what C.S. Lewis says in his book, Abolition of Man. By the way, if somebody wants to start with philosophy, that's not a bad place to start.
Good point. That's a great
book. But he says from the beginning, the problem isn't that we have too many emotions. And actually, in some way, our culture has become about nothing but emotions, right? Touchy-feely, feeling is everything, truth is really not out there. It's just in my feelings. So yeah, things have gone wrong. But he says the problem is not that there are too many emotions, but that what we need are real emotions. Emotions have become incredibly superficial. But part of the reason we don't have real emotions is because all of these great truths, as you said, like that we encounter in theology and philosophy, they haven't been communicated to the heart. And if they were, then these very deep and genuine and important emotions would actually, I think, take up space in the soul and transform those superficial emotions, push them out, so to speak.
Exactly. Filter them out through the criteria of truth and objectivity and reason and so forth, and order them. I think there's nothing more liberating, at least why theology liberated me, is first the acknowledgement of the emotions, but then understanding how they're subject to reason, and how I like your image of the passing the baton between freedom and emotions, because your free choices do then shape, inform, and determine your emotions, and so it is I think that's a trick of our faith, is that you can't escape the whole loving God with your whole heart, mind, soul, strength. This takes an emotional intelligence that is throwing the baton back and forth between self, between others, and so we have to stay engaged, but that's what makes it an adventure, and that's what makes it fun. So anyway, is there anything else you'd like to share with us? This has been such a fantastic conversation. So excited to talk to you about all this, and it's also a teasing conversation, because now I want to go off and read all these things and listen to more of your lectures. So is there anything else you'd like to say before we say goodbye today? This was fantastic.
Well, just because it is Valentine's Day is coming up, I maybe just give you kind of an image that I give to my students about the importance of love. That in the end, St. Paul tells us faith, hope, and love are going to remain, and the most important of these, of course, is love. And the picture that I have is of sort of standing before the judge, and he, in a sense, what it means to go panning for gold is kind of a corny image, but he takes our lives and he sifts everything away. He pans for love. Right. And we know that from the saints, that's the only thing that's going to remain, only what has been done out of love and for love of God or for love of neighbor, human natural loves and so forth. And I think that we shouldn't stint in living love. We, in a sense, see your life as often as you can from the last moment when you'll say, I wish I had done more for you.
So, that is so inspiring. I love it. All about the other. That's your new thing, right? All about the other.
I love that.
That's just like what a little examination of conscience that was for me right now. At the end, are you gonna regret loving more? No, absolutely.
Yes, exactly. That's beautiful. Yeah, and Simone, I just want to thank you for this, because you've made this so easy and pleasant, and I love hearing your reflections as well, which are so insightful and intuitive. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Maria, and hopefully we can have you back on soon. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.